Alexander King had everything a man could dream of. From his penthouse perched high above Manhattan, he could look down at the glowing city lights as though they were his personal kingdom. At 44, he was not just wealthy, he was untouchable. His empire, King Global Holdings, spanned continents. The men in tailored suits who toasted to him in the stock exchange spoke his name with reverence, and women whispered it with equal parts desire and envy. Yet behind the immaculate veneer, Alexander carried a flaw so deeply rooted, he no longer recognized it as one arrogance. It was arrogance that fueled his rise. He believed he could bend any deal, manipulate any boardroom, and control any outcome. He thrived on winning not just in business, but in life. And at one of his legendary cocktail parties, where champagne flowed like water and laughter echoed off marble walls, Alexander found himself drawn into a game that would unravel everything he thought he knew about himself. The room shimmered with crystal glasses, velvet gowns, and men discussing the futures market as if it were a chessboard. Alexander moved through it with ease, shaking hands, flashing that polished smile, receiving admiration like a man receives oxygen. He loved being envied. It was his oxygen. But among the crowd, Marcus Layton watched him with a smirk. Marcus wasn't just another guest. He was an old friend, a rival, and the only man who dared to prod at Alexander's invulnerability. Still the same, Alex, Marcus said as Alexander joined him by the bar. Always the man who wins. Alexander tilted his head with a faint smile. Would you expect anything less? Marcus swirled the wine in his glass eyes, narrowing. Not at all. But tell me, don't you ever get tired of it? The same women, the same parties, the same trophies that only confirm what you already know, that you're untouchable. Alexander raised his glass in a mock toast. Why fix something that isn't broken? But Marcus leaned closer, his voice dropping into something sharper, almost mischievous. Because, my friend, you've built walls so high, no one can surprise you anymore. You don't crave victory, you crave challenge. And maybe it's been too long since you've had one. The words cut through the haze of flattery that surrounded Alexander nightly. He arched an eyebrow. A challenge. What do you have in mind? Marcus's smirk widened. A bet. The word sank in like a hook. Alexander was competitive to the core. His life had been one long series of bets, some written into contracts, others unspoken, but always won. Marcus knew exactly which chord to pluck. You have a type, Marcus continued. Young, glamorous, beautiful. Women who fit seamlessly into your world, who know which fork to use at dinner and how to smile at the right photographer. What if you stepped outside your world entirely? What if you married someone who didn't belong here at all? Alexander laughed sharp and amused. Marry. That's your big idea, yes, Marcus said calmly. I dare you to marry a woman completely opposite of your standards. Someone who doesn't worship your money, who doesn't bend to your world. And you have to stay married for 6 months. No excuses, no loopholes. Just you and her. I bet you won't last. Alexander's pulse quickened. It was absurd. It was reckless. But it was also intoxicating. And if I win, I'll personally invest $50 million into King Global, Marcus said, without hesitation. No strings attached. Alexander chuckled, setting his glass down. And if I lose, then for once in your life, Alex, you'll be the man who failed. The challenge sparked something inside him, a flame that was equal parts pride and recklessness. He extended his hand, and Marcus shook it, sealing the bet. That night, long after the guests had left and the penthouse had fallen quiet, Alexander sat alone by the glass wall, overlooking the city. The thought pulsed in his mind like a drumbeat. It wasn't about money. He already had more than he could ever spend. It was about proving that nothing, not even love, not even human connection, was beyond his control. He would win this bet. He always did. The search began swiftly. His assistant discreetly compiled profiles, women from backgrounds far removed from the polished halls of high society. He reviewed them like investment portfolios, coldly, efficiently, until one name made him pause. Celeste Johnson, 36 years old, African-American, plus-sized with warm, expressive eyes in the photograph framed by natural curls. A social worker who ran a non-profit for underserved communities. She had no ties to the elite, no interest in wealth, and a reputation for speaking her mind. Alexander's lips curved into a smile. She was perfect not because she fit his world, but because she didn't. The meeting was arranged under the pretense of a potential partnership. He would dangle funding in front of her nonprofit, and in return, he would propose the arrangement. It would be just another negotiation, he told himself, another contract with fine print. When Celeste walked into his office, however, Alexander found himself uncharacteristically disarmed. She wore a simple navy dress, professional but unpretentious. She carried herself with a quiet strength, her shoulders squared, her gaze steady. "Mr. King," she said, extending her hand. Her voice was warm, but her tone held no reverence, no awe. "Thank you for reaching out. I wasn't expecting a man like you to take interest in our work." Alexander clasped her hand, masking his intrigue with charm. "Ms. Johnson, I believe, in supporting meaningful causes." As she spoke about her organization, about families struggling to survive, children who needed opportunities, neighborhoods forgotten by everyone but her. Alexander listened, or rather he tried to listen. A part of him was already framing the proposition, calculating how best to present it. Yet something in the way she spoke unsettled him. She wasn't pleading or pandering. She spoke with conviction, not for herself, but for those she represented. At last he leaned forward. "I have a proposal for you," he said smoothly. Her brow furrowed. "What kind of proposal, marry me?" The word hung in the air like a gunshot. Celeste froze, her lips parting in disbelief. "Excuse me." Alexander's expression remained calm, rehearsed. He explained the terms, carefully concealing the true reason. He spoke of improving his public image, of aligning himself with a cause that mattered. He offered her funding stability for her nonprofit, visibility for her mission. Celeste stared at him, her eyes narrowing. "You're asking me to marry you, not for love, not for family, but as some arrangement. A business deal. Think of it as a partnership," he replied evenly. Silence stretched between them. Celeste's instincts screamed against it, but the faces of the people she served, the children who relied on her, flickered in her mind. With his resources, she could expand her work beyond imagination, but at what cost to herself? Finally, she spoke. "I'll need time to think." As she left his office, Alexander allowed himself a small smile. The seed had been planted. She would come around. They always did. What he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly imagine, was that this woman, and the one he thought he could bend and control like every other piece on his chessboard, would turn his world inside out. The wedding was arranged with the efficiency of a corporate merger. Alexander wanted no delays, no time for Celeste to reconsider. Within weeks, he had orchestrated a ceremony small by his standards, but still dripping with quiet opulence. A private chapel draped in white roses, a pianist playing soft classical pieces, guests drawn from his circle of business partners and distant relatives, all dressed in muted elegance, their eyes curious and skeptical. Celeste arrived in a simple ivory dress she had chosen herself. She had refused the designer gowns his assistant tried to force on her, refused the diamond tiara, refused the army of stylists. She stood tall, her natural curls framing her face, her posture steady. But inside, she felt like an intruder in a world that wasn't hers. She had deliberately left her own friends and family uninformed, unwilling to explain a union that had nothing to do with love. As the vows were spoken, Alexander looked every inch the conqueror. To him, this was victory already sealed, another deal closed. Celeste, however, looked at him with a composure that masked the storm inside her chest. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, she did not feel like a bride. She felt like a bargaining chip. The reception was no better. Crystal glasses clinked. Conversations buzzed around investment strategies and art collections. Alexander moved effortlessly through the crowd, shaking hands, smiling, basking in the admiration of men who envied his confidence. Celeste sat quietly at a corner table, watching it all unfold with a mixture of detachment and simmering unease. Later that night, when Alexander escorted her into the penthouse that would now be her home, the contrast between their worlds became undeniable. The space was breathtaking polished marble floors, walls lined with modern art windows, stretching from ceiling to floor, unveiling the glittering Manhattan skyline. It was by any measure magnificent, but to Celeste it felt cold. "This is your home now," Alexander said, gesturing at the space with a subtle flourish. "I trust you'll find it comfortable." Celeste's gaze swept across the sleek furniture, the spotless surfaces. She set down her small overnight bag and replied quietly, "Comfort has never been measured by square footage." He smirked, pouring himself a drink. "You'll get used to it." But she had no intention of getting used to it. She unpacked her belongings in the guest room, a clear signal that she did not see herself as his wife, in any intimate sense. Alexander raised an eyebrow but said nothing. He had learned long ago that some negotiations required patience. In the days that followed, their arrangement took shape. Alexander kept his word, and large sums of money were transferred into Celeste's non-profit, enabling her to expand programs, hire new staff, and upgrade facilities. But tension simmered beneath every interaction. He tried to shower her with lavish gifts, a necklace encrusted with diamonds, a watch worth more than a year's salary for most people. She looked at them, then pushed them back gently across the table. "If you want to give me something, put it into the new community center. These jewels mean nothing to me." He laughed, masking irritation. "You really don't play the game, do you?" "I don't have time for games, Alexander," she replied, her voice steady. He invited her to high society events, charity galas, where women glittered in gowns worth fortunes and men boasted about deals made over vintage wine. Celeste attended one out of obligation, but the evening was unbearable. She endured thinly veiled questions from women asking how they met their eyes, darting toward her body with faint disdain. She caught the smirks of men who whispered to each other, wondering what on earth Alexander King was doing with her. That night, in the limousine ride home, she stared out the window in silence. Finally, she said, "Don't ever drag me to those things again. They don't care about what I do or who I am. And frankly, I don't care about their world." Alexander frowned. "Those events raise millions of dollars. For the organizers," she snapped, turning to face him, "but rarely for the people who actually need help. Real change doesn't come from empty speeches and tax-deductible donations." Her words cut him, though he would not admit it. He had spent years perfecting appearances, believing philanthropy was measured in checks and headlines. To her, it was nothing but smoke. Still, his pride wouldn't let him retreat. If she wouldn't step into his world, he would force her to. But Celeste had other plans. One Saturday morning, she insisted he come with her to a neighborhood event hosted by her organization. Alexander agreed reluctantly, more curious than committed. They drove through streets he had only ever passed in quick glimpses from the tinted windows of his car. The cityscape shifted from glass towers to crumbling buildings, from designer storefronts to corner stores with faded signs. When the car stopped in front of a converted warehouse, Alexander felt a rare unease. The once derelict building now pulsed with life. Murals covered the walls. Children laughed as they chased one another. Volunteers bustled inside carrying boxes. Celeste was already there, wearing jeans and a navy rise-up t-shirt, her curls tied back, as she directed traffic with calm authority. Families greeted her like an old friend, volunteers turned to her for guidance, children clung to her arms. Her energy filled the space, a sharp contrast to the aloof composure she carried in his penthouse. "Glad you could make it," she said when he stepped out of the car, her tone brisk, almost professional. "Come on, we're starting with the food pantry." Inside, Alexander found rows of tables stacked with cans of food, fresh produce, bags of rice. Volunteers handed out supplies to tired-looking parents, grateful smiles passing across weary faces. Celeste explained the system. Over 200 families received food here every week, families fighting unemployment, low wages, or medical debt. Alexander listened, but his mind kept flashing back to the boardrooms where he had moved millions in a single hour. 200 families. It seemed so small, almost insignificant. And yet the relief on their faces told him it was monumental. He bit back the urge to say something dismissive, realizing how hollow it would sound. They moved on to the tutoring area, where children sat at small tables with volunteer teachers. The walls were bright with posters and crayon drawings. Celeste knelt beside a boy struggling with a math worksheet, her voice patient, her hand steady on his shoulder. Alexander stood at a distance watching. For the first time in years, he felt like an intruder. Here his power meant nothing. Here it was Celeste who commanded the room. Later, as they left, he asked almost reluctantly, "Why do you do this? You pour your life into these people." But why? She looked at him, her expression unreadable. "Because I know what it's like to feel invisible. Because someone has to care. And because doing nothing would be unbearable." Her words lingered in the air, heavier than any business deal he had ever negotiated. They followed him all the way back to the penthouse, where he sat in silence, staring at the glittering skyline. Normally, it filled him with pride. Tonight, it felt hollow, as though the light of the city could not erase the shadows pressing into his chest. Celeste carried a box of donations into the kitchen and didn't speak to him. He finally muttered, "Today was different." She raised an eyebrow. "Is that your way of saying uncomfortable?" He hesitated, then admitted, "Maybe. It's not the world I'm used to. That's obvious," she said, her tone cutting, but not unkind. "But maybe that's the problem. You've lived your whole life in a bubble, Alex. You don't know what it's like to worry about rent or food or whether your kids will be safe tomorrow. That's the reality for millions of people." The word stung, but he didn't fight back. Instead, he nodded slowly. "You're right. I don't understand, but I'd like to." Celeste looked at him for a long moment, then turned back to the counter. "We'll see. Actions speak louder than words." For Alexander King, who had spent a lifetime believing words and money could win anything, it was the first time he realized neither would save him now. The weeks that followed were marked by tension so thick it hung over the penthouse like fog. Alexander had entered this marriage confident he would bend it to his will. He was a man used to controlling everything market steals people, yet here was a woman who would not yield. Every attempt to draw her into his world was met with a firm, unshakable refusal. He arranged dinners at the most exclusive restaurants. Celeste showed up in the same understated dresses she wore to the community center, sitting through courses of delicacies with polite indifference. When he tried to impress her with exotic wines and aged whiskeys, she only smiled and asked, "Do you ever think about how many meals could be bought with the price of that bottle?" Her words cut, though he laughed them off in front of others. At home, he attempted to reassert control through his wealth. He had jewelry delivered to her room, gowns from top designers' invitations to galas where she would shine on his arm. But Celeste always pushed back, reminding him she had her own standards, her own life. "I didn't marry you for trinkets," she told him one night, placing a velvet box containing a necklace back on his desk. "I married you for my community. Don't mistake this arrangement for anything else." It should have infuriated him. Instead, it unsettled him. He had expected a woman dazzled by wealth, someone who would eventually give in. But Celeste was different. She carried herself with a dignity that refused to be bought, a quiet power that left him for the first time in his life unsure. The more she resisted, the more he tried to impose his world on her. He began insisting she attend high society luncheons, framing them as opportunities to build connections for her nonprofit. Celeste reluctantly agreed once or twice, only to find herself seated among women who treated her like a curiosity. "So Celeste," one woman asked at a luncheon, her diamond earrings glinting in the light, "how did you and Alexander meet? It must have been quite the fairy tale." Celeste forced a polite smile. "We met through mutual connections." "And your work, what is it you do again?" "I run a nonprofit," Celeste replied firmly. "We focus on providing resources for underserved communities." The woman's smile faltered, and her interest evaporated. "How noble," she said dismissively, turning back to her companion to discuss vacation homes in the south of France. Celeste's jaw tightened. She glanced at Alexander across the table, engrossed in conversation, oblivious, or perhaps deliberately ignoring her discomfort. That night, as they rode home in silence, she finally turned to him. "This isn't working." He looked at her, feigning confusion. "What isn't this?" she said, gesturing between them. "You drag me into rooms where I don't belong, where people dismiss me before I even finish a sentence. And you think this is useful? It's not. It's a waste of my time and yours." Alexander's expression hardened. "Those events are opportunities. If you played your cards right, You could secure funding, build alliances. I don't play games, Alexander. She interrupted, her tone sharp. My work isn't about pleasing donors or flattering your friends. It's about real people with real struggles. And the truth is, your world has no interest in that. Her words were like a blade. He wanted to argue, to remind her that it was his money keeping her projects alive, that without him, her precious rise up would be nothing. But when he opened his mouth, nothing came out, because deep down he knew she was right. The cracks in his carefully built facade began to show. At the community center, she was radiant, commanding respect and affection with ease. Children flocked to her, volunteers listened to her every word. She belonged there. Meanwhile, Alexander stood at the edges, a polished statue with no place in the living, breathing rhythm of her world. For the first time in his life, he was not the center of the room. And yet, instead of walking away, he kept returning. Some nights, he even volunteered, clumsily sorting supplies or carrying boxes. The volunteers were wary of him, their eyes full of suspicion. They whispered that he was only there for appearances, and perhaps they were right. At first, anyway. But the more time he spent there, the more those suspicions gnawed at him. He began to ask questions, listening as volunteers shared their stories. Stories of lost jobs, broken homes, debts that crushed entire families. He saw the faces of mothers holding babies with hollow eyes, teenagers desperate for a chance to break free. And each time something inside him shifted. Still, pride kept him from admitting it. Pride in the looming weight of the bet. Because no matter how much he tried to forget, Marcus's voice echoed in his head. This was just a game, a dare, a bet to prove you could win at anything. Every time Alexander looked at Celeste, every time he watched her speak with fiery conviction, he felt the sting of his own deception. She didn't know. She couldn't know. If she ever discovered the truth that he had married her, not out of respect, not even for the cause she lived for, but because of a drunken wager, she would never forgive him. And he couldn't explain why that thought began to terrify him. One evening, after a long day at the center, they returned to the penthouse. Celeste moved around the kitchen, unpacking a box of donated goods she had brought home for sorting. Alexander poured himself a drink, watching her quietly. For once she seemed unaware of him, humming softly under her breath. "Why do you fight me at every turn?" he asked suddenly. She froze, then looked up puzzled. "What do you mean?" "You reject everything I offer," he said, his voice sharper than intended. "The gifts, the events, the life I can give you. Most women would—" "I'm not most women." She cut in, her tone firm. "And maybe that's the problem. You see people as things to win, Alex. But I can't be one. Not by you. Not by anyone." Her words struck deeper than he cared to admit. He tried to laugh, to dismiss it, but the sound died in his throat. That night, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling while the city lights flickered beyond the glass. For the first time, he felt something foreign creeping into his chest. Fear. Not fear of losing a bet or losing money, but fear of losing her respect. Celeste was supposed to be the pawn in his game. Instead, she had become the opponent. And slowly and possibly, she was winning. The storm came quietly at first, as most storms do. For days, Alexander and Celeste orbited each other in uneasy silence. She poured herself into her work at Rise Up, often staying late at the community center, coming home, exhausted but resolute. He buried himself in his empire, signing deals and attending meetings with the same relentless efficiency, yet finding less satisfaction in victories that once fueled him. The distance between them grew heavier with every word unsaid. And then Marcus reappeared. It was over lunch in a private club, the kind of place where mahogany tables gleamed and waiters moved like shadows. Marcus leaned back in his chair, smirking as he sipped his drink. "I have to admit, Alex, you've surprised me," he said. "I didn't think you'd last this long." Alexander frowned. "What do you mean?" "This whole charity act," Marcus said with a chuckle. "Tagging along with that woman, pretending to care about soup kitchens and after-school programs. It's impressive. But let's be honest, it's not you. You're a businessman, not a saint." Alexander's jaw tightened. "People can change." Marcus arched an eyebrow. "Maybe. But don't forget why you started this. A bet is a bet, Alex." The words hit him like a punch. For weeks he had buried the truth under layers of denial, almost convincing himself it didn't matter anymore. But now, sitting across from the man who started it all, he felt the weight of the lie like iron chains. That night back at the penthouse, the silence between him and Celeste was unbearable. She set her bag on the counter and began sorting through a stack of donation receipts. He watched her heart pounding the confession, pressing against his throat. Amara, he stopped himself, catching the slip of another name from a memory. Celeste, he corrected, voice unsteady. There's something I need to tell you. She looked up, wary but patient. What is it? He drew a breath, every word tasting like glass. When I first came to you, when I proposed this marriage, it wasn't because of your work, or even because of you. It was because of a bet. The words hung in the air like poison. Celeste froze, her hands slowly lowering the papers onto the counter. A bet, she repeated, her voice sharp with disbelief. Alexander nodded, shame burning through him. Marcus challenged me. He said I couldn't marry someone outside my world and make it work. I thought I could prove him wrong. I thought I could win. Her face hardened, her voice trembling with fury. So I was just what? A pawn. I dare it. Something you could use to prove you're invincible. No, he said quickly, stepping forward. Not anymore. That's how it started, yes, but things changed. You changed me. Celeste, I stop. Her voice cracked like a whip, silencing him. Her eyes burned, not with tears, but with righteous anger. Do you have any idea what you've done? You didn't just lie to me. You mocked everything I stand for. You turned marriage into a game. You turned my life into a stunt. I know, Alexander whispered. His voice broke raw in a way it had never been. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I couldn't keep lying to you. I had to tell you the truth. Celeste stared at him for a long, agonizing moment, her chest rising and falling, as though every breath cost her something. The truth? The truth is you never saw me. Not as a person, not as a partner, just as a prize to be won. Celeste, please no. She cut him off, her voice, steady now, steel beneath the anger. You don't get to ask me for anything. I don't know if I can ever trust you again, Alexander. And without trust, there's nothing. She grabbed her bag, slinging it over her shoulder, and walked to the door. He followed, desperation clawing at his chest. Celeste, wait. Please let me prove to you that I've changed. She turned once, her eyes fierce, her voice like a final verdict. Change isn't enough when it comes at the expense of someone else's dignity. The door clicked shut behind her, and Alexander was alone. The days that followed were the loneliest he had ever known. The penthouse, once his castle, felt cavernous and empty. He sat by the window at night, staring at the skyline, but the glittering lights no longer stirred pride, only regret. He threw himself into work, but every deal felt hollow, every victory meaningless. Meanwhile, Celeste pressed forward with Rise Up. She refused to let his betrayal derail her mission. She worked longer hours, poured herself into her programs, and leaned on her volunteers. Yet even as she smiled at the children, even as she delivered speeches of resilience, the weight of what he had done lingered like a shadow. But Alexander, for the first time, did not retreat into arrogance. He began to change, not for a bet, not for appearances, but because the man in the mirror disgusted him. He donated millions to rise up, not to win her back, but because he believed in the work. He showed up at the community center unannounced, not as a benefactor, but as a volunteer. He scrubbed floors, carried boxes, sorted donations. At first, the volunteers eyed him with suspicion, but over time, they saw he was not afraid to get his hands dirty, not too proud to admit when he didn't know what he was doing. And Celeste noticed. From across the room, she watched him work quietly. Sleeves rolled up tie, discarded, no polished smile to shield him. He wasn't the Alexander King who closed billion-dollar deals in penthouses and boardrooms. He was just a man trying to earn back the right to stand beside her. Still, she held herself back. Trust once broken was not easily restored. One night, after hours at the center, she found him sitting with a teenage boy, helping him with a homework assignment. She paused in the doorway, listening as Alexander patiently explained the math problem, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. When the boy grinned, finally understanding, Alexander smiled too, and it was genuine. Celeste turned away, her chest tight. She wasn't ready to forgive him, but for the first time, she wondered if he might truly be changing. Months passed each day, marked not by boardroom victories, but by the humbler rhythm of redemption. For Alexander, life became stripped of the easy validations he had once thrived on. No more applause at galas, no more headlines about acquisitions. Instead, there were food drives, long afternoons carrying boxes, and evenings sitting in cramped offices reviewing grant applications. He showed up every day, not for recognition, but because he had to prove to Celeste, to the community, and to himself that he was no longer the man who once saw people as pawns. The transformation was not smooth. Volunteers still whispered that he was a billionaire, playing at humility. Some openly challenged him, asking if he was only there to soothe his guilt. And Alexander, instead of bristling, listened. He admitted when they were right. He admitted he had been blind, arrogant, selfish. The admission itself was a wound, but it was also the first step toward healing. In time, his actions began to speak for him. He helped launch a job training program, pulling strings with his corporate contacts, but letting Celeste and her team take the credit. He quietly arranged for medical debt to be forgiven for dozens of struggling families, never attaching his name to the gesture. He even began reshaping King Global Holdings, forcing policies through his board that prioritized fair wages, ethical sourcing, and local investment. His peers mocked him, some even threatened to pull their support. But Alexander no longer cared about their approval. For Celeste, the change was impossible to ignore. She watched him from a careful distance, wary but curious. She had expected him to give up after a few weeks, to return to his penthouse and his arrogance. Instead, he persisted. He stayed long after the cameras were gone, long after the initial sting of guilt should have faded. And slowly, impossibly, she began to see glimpses of something real. One autumn evening, the community gathered to celebrate the opening of a new Rise Up Center, an achievement that had once felt impossible. The building gleamed with fresh paint-bright murals and laughter spilling from every corner. Families filled the halls, children clutching balloons, volunteers serving food with smiles that felt genuine, earned. Celeste stood at the entrance, her exhaustion masked by pride. This was her victory, her community's victory. She shook hands, hugged old friends, greeted newcomers. And then she saw him. Alexander stood quietly near the doorway, dressed not in a tailored suit, but in jeans and a simple sweater. He held no glass of champagne, made no effort to draw attention. His eyes searched the room until they met hers, and for a moment the noise of the celebration faded. He walked toward her, a small envelope clutched in his hand. "Congratulations," he said softly, his voice stripped of its usual bravado. "This place, it's incredible. You should be proud." Celeste studied him, cautious. "This isn't about me. It's about them," I know, Alexander said. He held out the envelope. "This is a personal donation. No strings attached. Separate from the company. Just from me." She took it but didn't open it. Her eyes stayed on him, searching for the familiar mask of charm and calculation. But it wasn't there. Instead, there was something quieter. Vulnerability. "You didn't have to come here for this," she said. "I didn't come just for that," he admitted. He hesitated, running a hand through his hair. "I came because I needed to say something." Again, "I'm sorry, Celeste. Not just for the bet, but for everything. For the way I dismissed you. For the way I tried to control everything. For not seeing you for who you are." Her throat tightened, though she forced herself to stay steady. "And now you think a few months of volunteering erases that?" He shook his head. "No, I don't expect forgiveness. Not now. Maybe not ever. I just want you to know that I see you now. Truly. And I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be a man worthy of that sight." She stared at him, her heart pulled in conflicting directions. She wanted to stay angry, wanted to cling to the betrayal. But there was no denying what she saw: a man stripped bare, no longer hiding behind wealth or arrogance. She turned away before her resolve could falter. "Actions speak louder than words, Alexander. Remember that." He nodded, accepting her distance. He didn't push, didn't plead. He simply stepped back and let her move through the crowd, watching her with quiet reverence. Later that night, she opened the envelope. Inside was a letter handwritten in his neat, precise script. "Celeste, I spent my life building walls thinking they made me strong. But you showed me that strength comes from letting them down. I don't know if I'll ever deserve your forgiveness, but I will keep trying because you and your work have changed me in ways I never thought possible. Yours, Alexander. She read it twice, her emotions tangled. She wasn't ready to forgive. But for the first time, she wondered if there might be a path forward. Weeks passed, and Alexander continued his quiet consistency. No grand gestures, no attempts to buy her love, just steady, relentless presence. Helping at food drives, sitting with children to read, attending late-night planning sessions without complaint. He no longer seemed like a billionaire stooping to charity. He seemed like a man finding meaning for the first time. And little by little, Celeste let down her guard. One afternoon, as they worked side by side packing boxes of food, she spoke softly. "You've changed." He glanced at her wary. "I had to." "I see that," she said. A pause then. "But change has to last. It can't just be a phase." "It will," he replied quietly. "Because this isn't about you anymore. It's about me, about being someone I can live with. And for the first time in my life, I feel like I'm getting there." She studied him for a moment, then allowed a small smile to tug at her lips. "We'll see." Months later, they stood together at another Rise Up event. This time, their presence side by side drew no whispers, no speculation. They weren't a billionaire and a social worker forced together by a bet. They were partners, uneasy, still healing, but bound by something new. As the sun set, casting golden light across the city skyline, Alexander turned to her. His voice was low, sincere. "Thank you," she frowned. "For what? For giving me the chance to change. For showing me it's never too late to start over." Her eyes softened, the warmth in them, reaching him at last. "Just don't waste it, Alexander." "I won't," he said. And for the first time, there was no doubt in his voice. In that moment, he froze, not because of shock or arrogance, but because of awe. Awe at the woman who had entered his life as a bet and ended it as his compass. Awe at the way the tables had turned, leaving him humbled, reshaped, reborn. And beside him, Celeste Johnson, plus-sized, unshakable, radiant, stood not as a pawn in his game, but as the queen who had redefined it.